In this tutorial, we will look at the basics of animation in Roto and RotoPaint. So we'll start by creating a simple shape. You may notice that we already have a keyframe set. This is because the Auto key button is turned on, which creates a keyframe for the spline and also creates a keyframe for the Transform tab when first making the shape. As I move down through the shot and change the shape, I am adding keyframes. And as you can see, we will now have a very basic animation. Now if we turn off Auto key and I move to a frame where no keyframe has been set, I can no longer animate the shape. So in this case, I have to explicitly add a keyframe before I can continue. And I can do this here, or I can add a keyframe here, or I can right click anywhere on the shape and from the drop down menu choose Set Key, and I now have a choice of creating a key for everything, just the spline, the transform, or other attributes such as feather, colour, invert, etc. So I'll add a key to the spline and animate the shape. I'm also going to animate this point here. Now if we run through the animation, we'll see that this point I just moved is only animating between frames 60 and 70. This is because every time we move a point, we create a key for the entire shape, not just that point. If we go down to the curve editor and look at the meta curve, we will see that we have keys here for all the shape's keyframes, as well as any for the attributes and transform. So I could delete these, but what I have done is deleted the entire shape's keyframes, whereas what I really want to do is deal with just this point's keyframes only. So I'll undo that. Now to view the point's animation curve, hover over the points, right click and go down to the curve editor. We have the choice of viewing the point's curves, the points and feathers, points and tangents, or all related curves. As this can get quite cumbersome, we'll just bring in the points. And here they are. These will persist now in the curve editor until we make a new selection of points. I'll delete the main .exposition keys and move the keyframe down to frame 20. And now that point animates between frame 20 and 70. I can also set curve types here. For example, I'll set an ease in. On the Y curve, the original keyframes remain, and if I reframe and adjust these points, you can see that we are actually affecting the point's position rather than adjusting the interpolation between keyframes, which was the case with the old Bezier node. Okay, now let's look at another problem. I've animated the shape, but I want to add a feather to this point. So if I pull it out on frame 10, you'll see that it animates off as the feather has the original keyframes. I only removed the points keyframes, if you remember. So I'll bring the feathers keyframes into the curve editor by selecting points and feathers in the drop down menu. If we look at the feathers curve, you'll see the unwanted keyframes. I'll delete these and move the keyframes to suit. Now you'll see the feather holds for longer but still animates off. Not quite what I'm after. Instead, I will use the Ripple Edit mode. This allows you to apply changes throughout the entire animation, from the start to the frame you are on, or to the end of the shot, or between a range of keyframes. So now if I pull the feather out, it remains pulled out for the entire animation. However, when you are using Ripple mode, it is important to turn it off when you are finished. Otherwise you may end up with undesirable results, as it is still affecting the animation throughout. So far, we have been working with just one point. What if we want to bring in more than one point? We'll select the shape, right click, and bring in all points. We get a whole set of curves, which of course could be in the hundreds. How do we know which curve relates to which point? If we go up to the tool settings and turn on label points, we get a number for each one. So if I want to affect this point here, I now know it's point 0, and I can move it around in the curve editor here. Now let's have a look at the difference between animating the shape directly and using the transform controls. I'll create a shape, lasso it, and select it all. And as long as Show Transform Handle is turned on, then in Roto I get this control, or in the Transform tab I'll get this control. So using the Roto control, I can adjust the shape, rotate it, etc. I'll reselect it, and this time I can scale it on a different line. I'll just rotate it back and you see how the shape has changed. I can select a couple of points and rotate them around a common center. So I'll just create a few more keyframes for this animation. If you want to, you can change the rotation center by holding Control or Command and drag the center jack. I'll just create a third keyframe here and rotate the entire shape. Okay, this is what we have so far. Now on frame 20, I want to move it down here, and the animation looks like this. However, let's say I want to move the whole shape from here to a different position, say all the way over here. Because frame 20 already has a keyframe, I don't get the animation I was after. So rather than do that, what I will do is use the transform controls, create a keyframe if necessary, and then on frame 40 move the entire shape over. And now if we look at that, we will see that the shape is now moving as required. Another difference between the two modes is when rotating a shape. If I create the shape and rotate it through a large amount, I'll get the classic corkscrew effect. This is because the points move directly from one position to the next via the center of the shape rather than the whole shape rotate. So instead, I will use the transform controls. So I'll just undo that, just check to see if I need to create a keyframe, move down to frame 40 and add the rotation. If you press shift when dragging the jack, you can avoid snapping to angles. And now we have a proper rotation added on top.
Next, let's have a look at the way keyframes are displayed in more detail. Here I'm creating a few keyframes on a shape on frames 1, 40 and 60. So let's step back to frame 40, and here it tells us that we're on keyframe 2 of 3. Also, we can use these tools here to jump to other keyframes. If we look at the time bar, we will see that the keyframes displayed will also depend on the mode that you are in. I'm creating a series of keys in the Transform tab of this shape. And the keyframes displayed here are different to the keyframes of the shape's animation. So the time bar displays this in context. This also depends on which shape is selected. So if I select different shapes, different keyframes are shown. One useful feature in Roto and RotoPaint is the ability to add trackers to shapes' points. Here is a simple card move which has been tracked, and what we're going to do is to apply these tracks to 4 points on a shape. So first off, we'll create a shape and cusp its points. And just to make it clearer, I'll colour it green. So now we would attach the tracks to each point by holding shift and dragging the tracking values over each point. And we can see that the shape is now attached to the tracking points. However, ideally I want this shape to go to the very edge of this card, not where the track is. If we look at the curve editor, we'll see that there is now a keyframe for every frame. So first thing I'll try is to just adjust these curves and move the point onto the edge of the card. However, due to the nature of the track, you'll see that there is a drift as we move through the shot. So we'll start again, but this time, instead of copying the tracks to each point, I will link the tracks by holding Control and drag and dropping onto the shape's points. Now if we load this into the curve editor, you can see that it is an expression, linking to track 4. So I want to add a custom knob in Nuke's terms to the Roto node. To do this, right-click and select Manage User Knobs from the pop-up. And in this case, I want to add a 2D position knob. I'll label this, and under the newly created User tab, I now have my new position knob. So if we go back to the shape's expression, I can now add this to it. Because I used the 2D position knob, Nuke is clever enough to apply the X to the X and the Y to the Y respectively. So I'll now create a keyframe here and apply my offset, and I'll go through the shot and adjust these values to suit. Now I have the shape's point based on a tracker with an offset applied, matching the shot. In the next tutorial, we will look at wire removal with RotoPaint.